Part of the human experience is wondering when the turbulence of life happens, when the layoffs at work happen, and despite you having been faithful and contributed to that company for years, you're laid off. When the miscarriage takes place, it's easy and natural to wonder, God, what are you doing up there? Does he know what he's doing up there? When the cancer comes back, when singleness is still a part of your story, and man, you're creeping past 30, and the story that God's writing in terms of your marriage and relationships is not the one that you hoped, it's easy to wonder, God, do you know what you're doing up there? When the spouse tragically passes and now you're a widow, it's easy to wonder, God, what are you doing up there? And Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is going to answer that question for us in a really hopeful and encouraging way. This has been a message that my family's clung to deeply in the past season that we've been walking through, and I'll explain a little more about that in a second. Well, good morning. Happy Father's Day. Let me pray, and then we will dive into Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Father, thank you for your word. Pray that you'd use it to encourage our hearts. Pray that you would allow just scriptures to come alive, Jesus to become even more famous in our hearts and be glorified. Thank you for the godly dads in the room. Pray that they would be strengthened and continue being those godly dads. And we thank you ultimately for Christ. In his name we pray, amen. Any Aggies in the room in here? A couple of years ago, I got asked to speak at a ministry called Breakaway in College Station. And it's a ministry that meets on Tuesday nights at 9 p.m. and loved what God is doing down there and said yes to going and speaking. And I didn't realize I had also said yes to speaking at a ministry at DBU Wednesday morning the following day. We got some DBU people here. And so I had a speaking engagement at 9 p.m. in College Station, Texas, which is about 3.5 hours away. And then I had a 9 a.m. the next morning. So I quickly did the math and realized I either need to get out of one of these commitments or I need to figure something else out, because if I drove back, I would just be running on 3 hours of sleep. Some people can do that. I can't do that and teach and put coherent sentences together. So I also had the thought that recently a friend of mine had started a plane chartering company and had private planes that he would rent out to people. And I thought, man, this is a shot in the dark, but I'm gonna call my friend and just say, hey, is there any chance I could borrow the plane and fly down there? It's a small prop plane, and then fly back. And he said, yes, if you'll cover the jet fuel, you can do it. And I said, that's amazing. I'm gonna fly in like Kid Rock. This is gonna be incredible. How much is the jet fuel? And little did I know, jet fuel is like liquid gold, because it was $2,000. And I said, well, that's gonna be a deal breaker. And then I turned to some of my community group who was also Aggies, and it said, hey, do you wanna split this 6 ways? I'm teaching on Kyle Field. And they were like, man, we are in. And so we decided we're gonna split it 6 ways. This is gonna be great. The day of that flight came, and whatever I was envisioning in my head in terms of what the airplane would look like, it was not what we were about to board. I wasn't envisioning Air Force One, but I also wasn't envisioning like the original plane the Wright brothers used to invent airplanes, which was much closer to what it was like. So we show up, and this thing is tiny, and it is cramped and old. All adjectives that you don't want to be used about the airplane you're boarding. And I'm looking around and I'm going, man, this is not assuring. To make matters worse, it had been storming and was storming outside, and there was fog all over the place. And then to put the chair on top of all of it, I actually knew the pilot. And his name was Mark, and I love Mark to death, but he was kind of the guy that joked around about not knowing what he was doing. He had actually worked for me in ministry before, and I don't want that type of relationship with my pilot. I want him to be like a brain surgeon where I just assume you graduated magna cum laude and just are steady Eddie, not Frank the Tank from the fraternity, and turn it around. That's not how you want to know your surgeon or your pilot. And that was Mark. On top of that, Mark only had 9 fingers. Story for another time, but I'm confident there's more than 10 buttons in the cockpit. So I'm seeing this, and we're up in the air, and every turbulence, you're feeling all of it. And the whole time, every bump that we hit, I'm going, does he know what he's doing? This is how it's all going to end, I think. I'm going down at the hands of Nine-Finger Mark. That was the story you're going to write on my tombstone. And we hit turbulence again, and I'm asking the same question. Oh man, I hope does he know what he's doing up there? Does he know what he's doing up there? Now, to make a long story short, we got there, it was fine, we landed, and I won't be flying with Nine-Finger Mark ever again, but everything was fine. But that experience of asking the question in the midst of that turbulence in the air of does he know what he's doing up there is really an experience that I think a lot of us can have in life when we hit the turbulence of life. That we can question, hey, God, do you know what you're doing up there? Part of the human experience is wondering when the turbulence of life happens, when the layoffs at work happen, and despite you having been faithful and contributed to that company for years, you're laid off. When the miscarriage takes place, it's easy and natural to wonder, God, what are you doing up there? Does he know what he's doing up there? When the cancer comes back, when singleness is still a part of your story and man, you're creeping past 30 and the story that God's writing in terms of your marriage and relationships is not the one that you hoped, it's easy to wonder, God, do you know what you're doing up there? When the spouse tragically passes and now you're a widow, it's easy to wonder, God, what are you doing up there? And Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is going to answer that question for us in a really hopeful and encouraging way. This has been a message that my family's clung to deeply in the past season that we've been walking through, and I'll explain a little more about that in a second. But we're going to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 3. If you're just joining us, we're in a series called Under the Sun. Under the Sun is a word repeated in Ecclesiastes, and it's a metaphorical way of describing life without God. The author uses it over and over and over of under the sun. And in chapter 1, he laid out, by way of review, that under the sun, everything apart from God is meaningless. A generation comes and then goes. And then last week in chapter 2, we looked at his experiment that Solomon ran on looking for purpose and meaning and satisfaction. And the experiment he ran was, I'm going to chase after the most pleasure in life, the most success in acquiring possessions in life, the most success in terms of my profession, and discovered it was meaningless. And today in chapter 3, he's going to bring up the tension of life that is connected to God. So previously it was life disconnected with God, it's all meaningless. Today we're going to look at life connected to God. I heard a friend once say that when you read Ecclesiastes and this idea of, hey, it's all meaningless, and you read it in your 20s, you think, man, that is so depressing. Why is this in the Bible? And then you read it in your 30s and 40s and 50s, and you begin to think, I knew it. And there's some truth in that. But today in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, we're going to get an answer to God. What are you doing up there? And why we can trust him in the midst of that turbulence that we face. So we're going to be in verse 1 of chapter 3. If you have a Bible, you can go there. This is in the ESV version. If you don't have a Bible, it'll be up on the screens, but here's what he says. For everything, there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. He brings up for everything in life, there's an appointed time. And then he gives some examples. He says you're going to go through life, and there's a time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to cast stones away, and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek, and a time to lose. A time to keep, and a time to cast away. A time to tear, and a time to sow. A time to keep silence, and a time to speak. A time to love, and a time to hate. A time for war, and a time for peace. Now what he's doing is he uses these 14 different contrasts to lay out a part of the human experience. That in life, all of us are going to go through these various seasons in our life. The first thing that we see directly from the text in terms of points is there's a time for everything. He says there's going to be a time in human experience you're going to go through life, and every birth is going to eventually be followed by a death. There's going to be times of weeping in life, just like there's going to be times of laughter. And he's just laying out in a poetic way the human experience. In other words, this is not prescriptive and him giving you instructions on, hey, there's a time to kill. So after the service, if you're cut off in the parking lot, it's not like, hey, this is one of those times to kill. That's not his point. That's not what he's saying. He's saying in life, there's a roller coaster of the human experience. that you're going to go through on this journey and experience various things. What's interesting about this text is in some ways it's an answer to a trivia question. And that trivia question would be, what is the only text in the Bible that went on to become a number one Billboard hit in the United States? It was this song, or this verse, these verses. Anyone know what song I'm talking about? Turn, turn, turn. If you are under the age of 40, you probably don't know what that is, but it was a song that you probably actually would recognize because it was a song that was released in 1965, became a number one hit, and it verbatim ripped. In fact, if you go look up the credits for who wrote the song, it's John Steger, I think, whatever his name is, and then it also says Solomon next to it. Solomon contributed to that number one Billboard hit. It was a band named the Byrds who was just keeping alive the mop cut on the head. But it was a incredibly popular song about turn, turn, turn. For everything, there's a season. And Solomon is just saying, hey, you're going to go through life, and there's going to be highs and there's going to be lows. He is telegraphing what to expect on the human experience. It would be like if somebody, before I got on that airplane, sat down with me and said, hey, here's what's going to happen. You're going to get on the plane, it's going to take off, which means you're going to be more angled, and they just walk through. And then you're going to hit some clouds, and you're going to hit some bumps. There's going to be turbulence along the way. Then you're going to go through a season of it being smooth. And then you're going to descend, and it's going to feel different than when you descend in a huge plane, because it's a different plane. And they just kind of told me what to expect. Solomon is laying out, hey, what to expect. That a part of the human journey, and you may be in a season of joy right now, and because of the brokenness in our world, to expect a season of hard ahead. That Jesus would similarly say, hey, in this world, you should expect to have trouble. But take heart, I've overcome the world. Candidly, these types of verses and what Jesus instructed, and the Bible teaches in general, makes the teachings in the church, like the prosperity gospel, incredibly silly. What is the prosperity gospel? Prosperity gospel is this idea that, hey, if you just have enough faith and you do enough good things and you give enough towards God, then he's going to give right back and you're going to have blessing all over your life. And if you just have enough faith, then everything's going to go well. And if you just believe enough, then the cancer's going to go away, which is just not true. Scriptures never teach that. And it does a great disservice if preachers get up and they say, hey, if you just have enough faith, then this will happen. Scriptures don't teach that at all. And candidly, that's a lot of people walk away from their faith because they were taught that if I just had enough faith, and then they tried to believe as best they could, and then it didn't happen. And they blame themselves, they blame God. That's not what the scriptures teach. Solomon is saying, you're going to go through life, and there's going to be times of joy, and there's also going to be times of mourning. There's going to be times of birth, and there are going to be times of miscarriage. And he's laying out the roller coaster of life. The joy is eventually followed by sorrow. Now, that is something probably we came in and have at least experienced in our life. But what he's going to say next, and the truths that he's going to lay out, where we're going to spend most of our time, are incredibly important to know and embrace as you and I ride the roller coaster of life. Here's what Solomon says. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has made everything beautiful in its time. That God will make every experience of joy and pain and every story beautiful in its time. The second point we see from the text and need to embrace as we ride through the roller coaster of life is that our God is a God who eventually weaves things together, makes things beautiful in time. In other words, if it is not beautiful, then God is not done, or we don't see clearly what he is up to and doing. Second point, as I said, is that God will make everything beautiful in time. In God's time. Not our time, but in God's time. He's not a God who makes things that are not beautiful, despite the fact that it can feel like that at times. My kids, a couple years ago during Snowmageddon, wanted to make a snowman. And they went outside and they built up their snowman and living their best life for the 1 or 2 weeks every other year that we get snow. And they make the snowman and they come inside and say, hey, Daddy, we need something for the eyes. And I said, I got you. Here's some Oreos. Put those on the eyes. My son says, I don't want the Oreos. I want raspberries. I want to put raspberries on the eyes. I said, I don't think that's a good idea. I think we should really go with Oreos. They're very symmetrical. I want the raspberries. Great, you do the raspberries. They called me out when they completed their snowman, and this is the snowman they showed me. I mean, that snowman will give you nightmares for weeks. Looks like the snowman from a Blair Witch Project or something. Anything but beautiful when they completed it. And the scriptures are abundantly clear. Our God does not hand us things that are not beautiful when completed. That in God's timing, he will make everything beautiful in its time. So if it's not beautiful right now, God is not done, or I can't see the whole picture of what he's doing. Romans 8:28 is a verse that really echoes this one. You could say this verse is the Old Testament version of Romans 8:28. Romans 8:28 is where the Apostle Paul talks about this idea, and he says, and we know, not and we hope, not and we think, not and we pray, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. We know for those who love God, all things, not some things, not God things, not good things, all things work together for good. That there is not an experience of pain that is wasted in your life or in my life. There's not a disappointment that you face that he will not weave together eventually for good, that he will not make beautiful in its time. Now, this is a verse that we have been clinging to in our home. I have shared before, and if you're new here, God has had our family on a journey where we've had to cling by faith, to trust. Like, how do you make that beautiful in time? 5 months ago this week, we said goodbye to our little daughter, Lottie Moon, who was born January 11th. And I remember when she was born, and she came out, and she was so beautiful. 7 pounds, 9 ounces. She made it full term. She had the thickest red hair. I mean, so much so the nurses from other areas were coming over just to see her and to see this, it was like a chia pet amount of hair. It was amazing. It's beautiful. Looked, and she came out and she was crying, and we didn't know if we'd ever get to hear those cries. And in the moment, I'm like, man, maybe we'll have longer with her than we think. I mean, she looks so good. She's crying. They're all positive things. And I remember holding her and sitting there with my wife, and we didn't know how long we were going to have. We thought maybe we'll have some days, maybe we'll have some hours. And 100 minutes went by. And we saw her take her last breaths and go from being in our hands to being in Jesus's. And man, there's moments, this past week, I woke up at 4 a.m. on Wednesday, and I couldn't get out of my head just seeing those last breaths and wondering, God, was she in pain? I don't know how God makes that beautiful in time. But I know my God is not a man that he should lie, and my God keeps his promises. And he will make that beautiful in time. And let me give you one even example of how a finite mind could conceive of a way God could make something so incredibly painful become eternally beautiful, as it relates to that story specifically. And I wouldn't die on this hill, and whatever I'm about to share, we know that it's even better in heaven, because no mind has seen, no ear has heard, no mind can conceive what God has prepared for those who love him. But here's one example of how something so incredibly painful could be turned on its head and become, oh, that is eternally beautiful and good. There is a case to be made that in heaven, those who lose children in this life will get a chance to raise those children in eternity. Why do I say that? Well, in multiple places in the scriptures, the new heavens and the new earth is discussed, and they bring up children in heaven. Now, why are there children in heaven? I mean, there's no marriage or giving in marriage, so why would there be children and families of procreation being born? Here's one example of this. It says this in Isaiah chapter 6. In that day, speaking of new heavens and new earth, the wolf and the lamb will live together. The leopard will lay down with the baby goat. The calf and the yearling will be safe with the lion. And a little child will lead them all. Verse 8, the baby will play safely near the hole of a cobra. Yes, a little child or a weaned child, aka a toddler, will put its hand in a nest of deadly snakes without harm. Nothing will hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. For as the waters fill the sea, so the earth will be filled with people who know the Lord. It says there's a child, a baby, and a toddler. Why are there babies and toddlers and children in heaven? Scripture's clear that they're there, and perhaps the most logical explanation would be that children who died young in this life are children in heaven, and the parents and believers who are parents who lost those children will get the eternal joy after suffering through the horrifically painful event of losing a child in this life. They'll get the eternal joy of getting to raise that child in a place where there is no harm, there is no sin, there is no pain. I think that's true, but regardless whether that is, it wouldn't die on that hill. We know it's going to be even better according to 1 Corinthians 2, verse 9. But if that was the case, the unique gift of getting to raise after suffering the unique pain, that'd be an example of God making something beautiful eternally. It furthermore would make verses like what Jesus said in Luke chapter 6, where he says this really peculiar verse that I don't think I've ever thought as much about till this season. He says, "Blessed are you who weep, for you shall laugh." Perhaps that would be the case for parents who had the weeping pain of losing someone replaced eternally with the joy and laughter of raising that child. I don't know, as I've said, it's going to be even better than we could conceive because our God makes everything beautiful in its time. And when I think about this body and this week preparing, I don't know how God is going to weave and make beautiful stories. Like a friend of mine that I had lunch with on Thursday, who 2 years ago received a call from his wife that shortly after putting their 8-month-old down, he had inexplicably passed away. Doctors that have no explanation. I don't know how God makes that beautiful, but I know he will. I think of women and men in our body whose spouse was widowed or abandoned, and now they're trying to raise kids all on their own. I don't know how he's going to make those who have battled for years and years miscarriage or been unable to conceive. I think of that young mom in our body who with young kids found out she was pregnant, and then shortly after that found out she was also diagnosed with leukemia and undergoing cancer treatments. I think of the innumerable people in the room who've battled with autoimmune diseases that are crippling every single day. How are you going to make all of those beautiful in time? And the answer is, I don't know. But I do know our God keeps his promises. And in the meantime, he's not apathetic to the pain that you have. Scripture show Jesus, when he walked on the planet, showcasing what God is like, the exact opposite of apathetic towards the pain of those around him. One example of that happened in John chapter 11. John chapter 11, we're told that Jesus had a close friend named Lazarus, one of his best friends. In fact, the people who told Jesus the news that, hey, Lazarus has died, didn't even say Lazarus. They said, the one that you love has died. Jesus shows up to the funeral, and there's people mourning and weeping around, and Jesus is about to go raise him from the dead. And he walks up, and he sees the tears, and he does something very peculiar. If you're God and you know you're about to raise him from the dead, he walks up, and he gives us the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Jesus, you are about to bring him back to life. Why are you weeping? It's as though he saw the pain and the brokenness and the way that created pain in the lives of people, and he knew better than anyone this was not the world that they were created to live in. And he weeps, knowing the fact that he's going to bring him back to life over the pain that they were experiencing. God is not apathetic to your pain. If anything, it's the opposite. He found your pain so intolerable that he went to a cross for you and for me to remove and rid our world of all the pain and sickness and sorrow and sin. In fact, he's a God who makes beautiful things in time that we see most clearly when he went to that cross. I mean, the greatest evil in terms of a day in human history, the day God was put to death, totally flipped on its head to become the greatest day of good in human history. So good that today we call that great day of evil Good Friday. The day that God was put to death. Because 3 days later was the day that death was put to death. Because our God makes things beautiful in his time. And finally, he finishes and tells us another attribute of God that is meant to comfort us in the seasons that we walk through and give some application as well. It says this, also, he, speaking of God, has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. And also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. He lays out a lot of different truths, but the primary thing that I want to hone on is that he lays out that God is sovereign over everything. He looks around and he brings up that God is doing something. God is at work from beginning to end. He lays out, hey, there's an eternity that's been placed in every human heart, which is why, as we covered last week, no amount of success, no amount of pleasure, no amount of status, no amount of achievement can ever fill that hole, because every single person, and if you weren't here, you can go listen to it, as we looked at just numerous stories of people saying, I have it all and it's still empty. And the reason that is because there's an eternal hole in every human heart, and nothing that is temporary can fill something that is eternal. Only God can fill that. As Augustine once said, our hearts are restless, Lord, until they rest in you. And then he lays out, yet so that he cannot understand what God has done from beginning to end. I mean, this verse will help you in life as you walk through what can seem like meaningless and a world where chaos happens and good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people, and it seems like everything is random. And he says, no, everything is not random. God is doing something. God is at work from beginning to end. Life under the sun seems random and seems meaningless, but no. There is one beyond the sun. And God is at work from beginning to end because God is sovereign over everything. Everything good and bad that you and I experience comes through his hands. Did God create evil? No. Man, in choosing to rebel against God, introduced sin into our world. God is not the creator of it, but God is sovereign over all of it. And that leads to specific responses he's going to cover here in a sec. But I want to hit again, he is not apathetic to the evil and the injustice and the pain and the suffering in our world. He was so not okay with it that he would be horrifically crucified on a cross to deal with that. We're told 3 applications from that text. And one of the reasons that our inability to understand God should lead us to, or one of the applications that says he's done this so that we would fear him. The same word for fear is that of worship or reverence towards him. Our inability to understand how in all the ways God is at work and God is moving and God is weaving together shouldn't lead us to doubt God, but should lead us to worship him. I mean, if you think about it, it's a silly thing to think that you could fully or I could fully understand God, that we would even want to worship a God that we fully understood. I mean, you don't fully understand your Labrador Retriever's behavior. What makes you think that you would fully understand what God is doing at all times? And that, the text says, should leave us to worship or fear or have awe and reverence towards him. The second application that we see in the text is to trust God's timing. That he says, live in the season that you're in right now. Enjoy. Find joy in the season that you're in. Don't wish it away or think living for someday out there and find yourself going, man, if only we just were past the diaper phase, or if only we were in the time where they're all in school, or if only it's so easy to just wish for the next season, have a case of the somedays, where I just want to, someday things are going to be better, and wait till they get in high school, and man, I can't wait until we're empty nesters, and now I can't wait till we've finished paying off college, and then I can't wait, and then to look back on your life, and you've just constantly looked to the next season, until you're so far down the road that now you stop doing that and you just start living in regret looking back. He's saying, wherever God has you today, to find joy and to embrace it just today. Don't worry about the next season. That has enough worry of its own. You got the young kids. Embrace it today. Find joy today. It's exhausting. It's hard. Yeah, all those things. And embrace it today. Don't make an idol of today, but just embrace where God has you today. If you're in a season that is joyful, to embrace that, knowing seasons ahead may be sorrowful. If you're in a season that is hard, to trust God's timing in that. And asking him, Lord, what are you teaching me in this time? How are you growing me in this time? As uncomfortable and painful and hard as it is, what are you at work doing? Scriptures even say that part of the ways God grows us is through trials that we face. James, the younger brother of Jesus, would say in James chapter 1, verse 2, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, that he's growing your faith. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Asking, Lord, how are you trying to grow me here? And maybe you're in a season of hard, and what you need to hear is the reminder there is no pain that God wastes, that he won't make beautiful in time. There is no pain that takes place in vain, that he won't work together for good. And giving yourself the freedom and the grace to grieve. That we do this funny thing as people, not even really just as Christians, where people will be in a hard time in life or something they're going through, and I'll sit down and we're talking and they're describing, often through tears, they're just like, this was really hard, this really discouraged me, and I'll say, man, I'm so sorry, and they'll say, it's okay, everything's fine. I don't know a lot in that moment, but I do know at this moment, everything is not okay. And one day it will be, but it's okay to say, it's really hard. And to give yourself the grace in the midst of that hard season, knowing that one day God will weave it together for good. It's funny, my friend who owned the plane and owned that chartering company flew with my other friend Mark all the time. And he had no fear. He has no fear. Every time he gets on the plane, they go through storms, they travel all over, and he has no angst. He's confident in Mark's ability to get the plane where it needs to go. Why? Because he knows the pilot well. He knows him as a pilot. He's seen him over and over again be able to know what he's doing and to get the plane to arrive. And along the journey of life, that's what oftentimes God is doing. He's growing our awareness of, hey, you're going to grow over life and have a confidence that comes as you get to know and grow in your relationship with me. Does that make it any easier, or does that make it still not a hard season? No, it's still a hard season, but you're going to grow in knowing that God knows what he's doing. And one day, we'll weave together and make all of that beautiful in his time. Ultimately, God has shown his timing can be trusted. The scriptures point to various occasions in the New Testament where it brings up timing in God. One of them is in Romans chapter 5, where it says, at just the right time, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Just the right time. Another one happens in Galatians chapter 4, where it says this, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. That all those years that had gone by between when the Israelites were in the desert and then they arrived in the promised land, and all of those years went by, was not some random introduction to Jesus that happened years later. It was the fullness of just the right time. God sent his son to be crucified on a cross, that our God's timing is impeccable and he can be trusted. He has proved it and shown it. And one day, as we know and see most clearly through that cross, he will make everything beautiful in its time. And that moment he was crucified, in the fullness of that time, put a punctuation mark that God can be trusted. That we can trust in the promises of God. Because he's a God who keeps his promises. And maybe you're in the room today and you've never heard the story or the message of what it means to even be a follower of Jesus. And, well, how do you even become a Christian? And you're back in church for the first time in a while. And so let me make that abundantly clear. What you have walked into is a group of people who are not worshiping and celebrating how great we are or how much we give or how amazing the amount of Bible verses that we know is, but you are walked into a room of people who worship a God who died on a cross for our sin and for your sin as payment for your sin, and then came back alive 3 days later showing the payment was more than enough. And the way that you can become a follower of Christ is by deciding, God, I'm going to trust in you, not in me. I'm going to decide to trust and put my faith that you died for me on that cross. And for those of us who've been walking through, and we are believers, and you're walking through a painful time, here's what I want you to hear. He will, in his time, make the valleys that you have fallen into or are in right now or face ahead beautiful. He is not a God who lies. He is a God who keeps his promises. And we can't always see it, and you may never this side under the sun see it. But one day you will. My wife and I, from time to time, will do puzzles, and like 500 or 1,000 person puzzles, and we'll get them together. And if you've ever done a big puzzle, you know that what you need is not just every one of the pieces. You also need the picture. Whether it's on the outside of the box or typically they have a picture that comes with it. And I say that because if you sat down and I gave you the bag of 1,000 pieces of these and you decided, I don't know what the picture is and I don't know what it is, I'm gonna get to weave and work together and put this whole thing together, you would lose your mind. Because the only way you can know where the piece fits is by having the bigger picture. And sadly, in this life, we see in part, so that you're not going to go through life and God has handed you a story and it seems like, man, there's weird edges here and why is it bent? And I wonder how this is going to fit together. And you're going to go through, and sadly, you're never and I'm never going to have the full picture. We just have our piece. But he has promised one day you're going to see the big picture, and you're going to see that even the most painful, horrific of circumstances and suffering will fit in, and I will make everything beautiful in this time. And so when you're holding on to the piece, don't lose heart, don't lose trust. You can take it to the bank. I will make everything beautiful in its time. And I see the full picture, and I need you to trust me right now. The story that he's writing and that piece, because all you can see and all I can see is my piece, is going to be fit together in a way that is beyond even human ability to articulate or a mind to conceive. How amazing is that? I'm going to pray, and we'll be dismissed, but I want to pray for a specific group. As I've prayed several times over this season, that maybe you are walking through a season of loss, a season of disappointment. And I just want to pray for you. And so will you close your eyes? And if you're comfortable, I just would love to pray for you. You close your eyes and then just raise your hand. And if you're not comfortable, you don't have to raise your hand. God hears. But I just would love to pray specifically for you and whatever you're facing. Father, I thank you that you're a God who's not apathetic to our pain. And I thank you for the stories that you're writing in this room. I think for every hand that is raised around, and I pray that, God, you would be more real to them than the fear, than the hard, than the pain. You would raise their awareness of your nearness to them, that you're not apathetic or distant. You haven't forgotten them. And that you would strengthen their faith to trust you. Father, thank you that you're a God who makes everything beautiful in its time, working all things together for good. Thank you that you showcased us that most clearly when you died in our place. For anyone who has never trusted in that and received that amazing news, would today be their day. Father, we thank you and we worship you now in song. Amen.